Hi, class. Welcome to Unit 2 of American History 1. We finished up the last unit talking about how the American colonists kind of psychologically were set up to uh, want independence. We talked about the Enlightenment and how that kind of set up a psychological idea among the colonists that government should come from the people and not just from an arbitrary king. We talked about how the English colonists, the American colonists, had less of a connection to the mother country England than they used to. Basically, the conclusion of the last unit talked about how uh, the colonists were sort of set up to to want to declare independence. And this unit is going to talk about the actual specific events that step by step brought the American colonists closer to declaring independence. And then at the end of the unit, we'll talk about how it struggled to create as a nation a new nation. So we'll start first, though, with the beginning event, and that's going to be the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War is basically going to be the first step on the road towards revolution, because as a result of the French and Indian War, England is going to start changing its policies towards the colonies in a way that is very distasteful to the colonies. Now, remember that the colonies were used to salutary neglect. They had rejected, rather aggressively at times, the navigation acts that had occurred during the 1600s, and England had backed down. Well, after the French and Indian War, England is going to start trying to clamp down upon the colonies again, and it's not going to go over so well. And this time, independence ultimately will be declared. One thing to keep in mind is that independence was not a majority movement, it was a minority movement. In other words, it was not very popular among most colonists. However, as time goes on, step by step, more and more American colonists are going to want to consider independence, but it was not a foregone conclusion at all. Even when the Declaration of Independence is created, less than half of the countries, or less than half of the American colonists, actually favored independence. You'll definitely need to make sure you get all the details from this lecture and the next lecture because there is a specific worksheet that does align to the content of these two first lectures of this unit. This unit is shorter, it only has 4 lectures, but it is very content rich. Okay, so to start off, let's talk about the French and Indian War. And the French and Indian War, in and of itself, isn't all that important so much as the aftermath is important. So, real quickly, let's go through the causes. Basically, England and France, if you look at the map here on the right, they were both claiming land in the New World, and they basically were in kind of competition. If you look here where I'm pointing with the mouse, you can see where basically the Appalachian Mountains are. The English colonists had land on the right-hand side, or the east side, and then the French had land on the western side. However, as the English colonist population started to grow, a lot of the English wanted to cross over the Appalachian Mountains into this area here, which, if you look at this map on the left, it zooms in on this. This highlighted part here is known as the Ohio River Valley. It's extremely fertile in terms of soil. It's great for farmland, and a lot of the colonists wanted to have some of that land. In fact, one of the colonists was a young George Washington, and he is going to actually be one of the people that helped start the French and Indian War. So what ends up happening is that as the border tension starts to grow, right along this border, again, I'm pointing it out on the map here, the English and the French are going to start building up some forts. Basically, they're already prepping to fight over this territory that they both want because it's so fertile. And specifically the French forts, which are going to be right here, if you look at this map, or if over here you look over, this will be where the French forts are on the insert map. Keep those forts in mind because those forts are going to be a big deal later on. Eventually, England's going to own those forts, and then after the American Revolution, England is going to refuse to abandon those forts, and they're going to use those forts to kind of help Native Americans attack the United States. So keep that in mind for later on. Okay, so in terms of the war itself, I'm not going to say a whole lot, but one thing that's definitely worth noting is that when the war breaks out in 1754, there are going to be delegates, which basically means representatives, from several different colonies that are going to try to meet in New York, and they have a specific reason to meet. And they have a very famous leader in this meeting, and that man is shown on the left-hand side, and many of you will probably recognize him as Benjamin Franklin. So Benjamin Franklin is going to lead a group of colonist representatives or delegates, and they are going to develop a plan. And this plan is known as the Albany Plan of Union. That is important to note for your key terms list. That's important to note later on. This is a huge turning point in the history of the colonies. What ends up happening is that these colonies are going to propose to unite and try to form a sort of governing body that unites them all, a central government or a federal government. This is extremely important to note because at this point, the colonies kind of see themselves as 13 individual colonies, and at this point, they're actually considering uniting as one. Now, why are they considering uniting? Well, if you look on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, there's a war going on, and it's better to be joined together than to try to fight the French separately. So, the reason that this is important is that not only are the colonies planning or at least considering joining together under one government, this is important because this is the first time that they ever tried to do that, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So ultimately, there's a problem. If you remember in the previous unit, we talked about how different colonies had different needs, how they had different cultures, different economies. They basically had so little in common that they could not agree on what the terms of the Albany Plan would be, and so they abandoned the plan. Around that time, Benjamin Franklin is going to create this famous cartoon that you've probably seen before showing a snake, and it says join or die. And the message that Franklin had, as you can assume, is that if the colonies cannot join together, they will be in danger. They could be attacked by the French, and so it's very important that they join together. Ultimately, they do not join together, but this is the first time, notice how I put this in all bold, this is the first time that the colonies ever even considered uniting. At this point in history, they were considering uniting against the French, as the English and the French were fighting over land in the Ohio River Valley. Eventually, the colonies will consider joining together again and actually will join together and form the United States whenever the United States declares independence from England. And it's important to note the Albany Plan of Union because, again, this is the first time they had ever even considered joining together. The plan fails, but you've got another seed planted here where the colonies are starting to kind of come together as one. One way to think of this, I think it was John Adams that said this, is that you've got 13 different clocks and they are not synced up with each other, but over time these 13 clocks are going to start being synced up with each other and strike the same hour at the same time. So again, this is the first time the colonies ever considered uniting, even though they don't. And one other thing to note here is that the head of this snake was the New England colonies. In the future, when the Declaration of Independence is signed, the part of the colonies that is most in favor of independence is going to be New England colonies, especially Massachusetts, because of things that happen in Boston. And you've heard of things that have happened in Boston before. We'll talk about that later. So as far as actual fighting going on during the French and Indian War, the two sides, it was not the French versus the Native Americans. It was actually the French and the Native Americans joined together with the English and the English colonies, the American colonies, fighting on the other side. So at this point, remember, the colonies do consider themselves to be part of England, or they consider themselves to be British, which means pretty much the same thing. And so the colonies with Mother Country England are going to fight against the French and their Native American tribe allies. And what's interesting is that George Washington ends up becoming a hero as a result of this war. He's one of the first people that goes into the Ohio River Valley trying to claim land for the English colonies. During one battle, he's going to actually end up having his horse shot out from under him twice. He's going to come out of the battle with 4 bullet holes in his coat, but he survives. So that's a very interesting thing to note, is that the future president of the United States, first president of the United States, who everyone knows the name of, nearly died in this war in the 1750s and 60s. So he is going to become a hero. He is going to be known not for his military victories. He actually loses more than he wins, but he is going to be known for his character. He is going to be known for his strong leadership. Ultimately, England is going to be able to win, and one of the reasons that England is able to win is because they had a better navy than France did. And so they're going to use this navy to basically block France from getting any more supplies or any more significant supplies, any more significant troops to help fight on their side of the war. So just like, or just remember what I said before in a previous unit, the importance of having a strong navy. When the Spanish Armada fell, it allowed the English to start colonizing. And here, the English Navy, which is at this point the most superior navy in the world, so far as I know, is going to be able to keep France from getting any supplies it needs for its troops or additional troops to fight the war. So in the end, England is going to win. Now, eventually, Spain's going to join this war, and they're going to fight for France, try to help France out. And ultimately, they chose the wrong side. Ultimately, England, with its superior navy, superior to both Spain and France's navies, uh, is going to be able to win. And of course, the English troops are going to perform pretty well. Here you see a rather graphic picture of the British troops fighting against Native Americans, and but ultimately the British are going to win. The next slide, I believe, is going to show you the before and after maps of the war. No, it doesn't. Never mind. I think it'll come up here shortly, though. So, in the end, the war is going to end with the Treaty of Paris of 1763. And keep that number in mind because there's two treaties of Paris that you need to be aware of in this unit. There's a Treaty of Paris of 1763 and a Treaty of Paris of 1783. The Treaty of Paris of 1763 happens before 1776, so you know it's before the American Revolution. The Treaty of Paris of 1783 is going to be one that ends the American Revolution, and it happens after 1776. So use 1776 as kind of a measure, as a way to tell the two treaties of Paris apart. So what ends up happening is that the war is going to end. You don't have to know of this war as a 7 Years' War, but it was actually a broader world war. You only need to know about the part of the war that was happening in the New World, and that's going to be the French and Indian War. Okay, and England is going to be the winner. And when you win a war, you usually have a lot of leverage when it comes to negotiating the peace treaty that ends the war. What ends up happening is that France is going to have to give all of the eastern part of New France to England. And England now is going to have not only the 13 colonies that were discussed in the last unit, but beyond the 13 colonies, west of the Appalachian Mountains, they're going to have all of the land going all the way to the Mississippi River, which includes the very valued Ohio River Valley that was talked about earlier. Spain was not too happy about the fact that they had helped out France and then France had gone on to lose. So France sort of owed Spain a consolation prize of sorts. And so basically everything that England didn't get from France, Spain got from France. And so Spain is going to end up getting everything west of the Mississippi River. And there will be some kind of questions over who actually owns the Mississippi River, because at this point, the Mississippi River is going to be the border between what the land that England owns and the land that Spain owns. And there is going to be tension there, especially over ownership of or use of the big port city at the very mouth of the Mississippi River, which will be New Orleans. Now, at this point, Spain will own New Orleans and claim ownership of the Mississippi River in general. And even if they didn't own the Mississippi River, any trade that happens on the Mississippi River goes through the Spanish-owned New Orleans at this point. Here's the map that I was referring to earlier. So if you look here on the right-hand side, you can see how the three major European countries kind of split up the land prior to the French and Indian War. And if, by the way, if you notice, there is some Russian colonization going on in what is now Alaska. We'll talk more about that later on. Look and concentrate more, though, on the map on the right. So if you look at the map on the right, you can see that France pretty much has no land left. And if you look at the Mississippi River, you can see that on this side of the Mississippi River, you have the 13 colonies and what is now eastern Canada and all this other land, including the Ohio River Valley. All that now, at this point, is going to be owned by England. Everything to the west of the Mississippi River, like you can see here, goes to the Spanish. Now, some of this land, especially this middle part of land, is going to change hands later on, but right now, as it stands, Basically, there's only two major players in what became the United States. You have England having land on one side of the Mississippi River, and you have Spain having land on the other side of the Mississippi River. Now, this war is going to have some consequences, and it's not going to go over very well for the colonists in the end. Now, let's remember that there was another major player in this war, and that would be the Native Americans. The Native Americans had done a lot to try to help the French win the war and had failed, and there was no love lost between the English and the Native Americans at this point. Now let's also remember those forts that I talked about that are right in this area that I'm highlighting with the mouse here. Who is owning these forts right now? It's not the French anymore. They built them, but they did not own them now. Now it's going to be the British. So you have a cluster of British forts in the middle of an area that is occupied by lots of Native Americans. Now remember, the Native Americans, there's no love lost between the Native Americans and the English. So look at the left-hand box where it says England's colonial policies evolve. That's where we go next. And then we'll get to England tightening its grip later on. So what ends up happening is at the very end of the French and Indian War, you're going to have a rebellion of Native Americans. The Native Americans are going to be very unhappy that the French are gone. Remember that the French and the Native Americans got along fairly well. And now the English colonists are going to start crossing the Appalachian Mountains, and they don't care for sharing land with Native Americans. We've already established that fact. We talked about the Powhatan Wars, we talked about King Philip's War, and now all of a sudden the Native Americans on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains feel invaded by the English, and they were being invaded pretty much by the English. So eventually, at the very conclusion of the French and Indian War in 1763, you're going to see a rebellion of Native Americans led by a chief named Pontiac. And what they're going to do is they are going to launch surprise attacks on pretty much every one of the forts that used to be owned by France but now is owned by Britain. In fact, they are able to successfully take over or defeat all but 3 of the forts that the British now own. Now, again, remember that the French built the forts, the British took the forts at the end of the war, and now you got Native Americans who aren't happy with English presence attacking the forts. In the end, however, the British are going to make a comeback, and they are going to be able to stop the rebellion. And one of the reasons they're able to stop the rebellion, and this is unfortunate for the Native Americans, is again basically biological warfare. Smallpox is going to spread among the Native Americans in the area, and a lot of them are going to die or be too weak to effectively fight as a result. And this is actually, some of you have maybe heard of the story of the British lacing blankets with smallpox and giving it to Native Americans in order to keep them, well, tricking them, telling them that they're giving them blankets to stay warm, but intentionally trying to infect them with smallpox. That is when this happens, during Pontiac's rebellion. However, the smallpox had largely already done its damage before the blankets were ever given, but again, the English did not treat the Native Americans well and sometimes even resorted literally to biological warfare. Okay, earlier I referred to salutary neglect, and I'm going to come back to that idea now and explain it more fully. So prior to this war, prior to the French and Indian War, and prior to Pontiac's rebellion, which is now shown in this map here, and you can see how much damage was done. Prior to the war, England had largely had a hands-off policy towards its colonies. Prior to the war, basically, the colonies had been allowed to do self-government. Remember the House of Burgesses, remember the town meetings in the New England colonies. And except for the time period whenever the Navigation Acts were being enforced and the Dominion of New England had been created, which remember the colonists hated, besides that episode of the strict enforcement of the Navigation Acts, overall England had, since the beginning, let the colonies govern themselves. After the French and Indian War, and especially after Pontiac's Rebellion, that changes. So at this point, the English government is going to say that the colonies need more protection. They need more British troops to protect them. They need to also, if they're going to be protected by these British troops, then they should help pay for these troops that are protecting them from threats like, well, it used to be the French, but now threats like the Native Americans or maybe future Spanish threats. And the colonists, on the other hand, are going to feel like they don't really need this sort of protection. They felt like they had performed pretty well during the French and Indian War. They felt like they had performed pretty well during the Pontiac Rebellion. And so they felt like they did not need additional British troops to help them out. In fact, not only that, they really felt like they did not need to help pay for these troops. So they're going to get upset because the English are going to end up sending in more troops. On top of that, England's in debt because of the war. So in the end, England is going to say to themselves, or the British government, the English government is going to say to themselves, we just spent a lot of money to fight a war to protect the colonists. We're actually in debt because of this. Pontiac's Rebellion proves that we need to keep the troops there. So it makes sense that the colonists should pay for this. So England now is going to start upping its troop presence in the colonies, and the colonies don't like this because they're not used to this. And of course, maintaining troop presence, maintaining a military is always expensive, especially back then. You have to find ways to feed all these troops. You have to find places to house all these troops. You have to pay for all of these things. And England is going to say that since it's for the colony's protection that the troops are there, then they should help pay off the debt from the French and Indian War. They should help pay off the debt that was accumulated during Pontiac's Rebellion, and they should pay for the upping of the troop presence that England was about to put in place. And this is really the beginning of the end of the relationship between the English colonies and the mother country, England, because of the policies that England's going to put in place. So basically, England's going to start passing some taxes to help pay for its military that the colonists don't like. You're going to see things like the Quartering Act, where suddenly the American colonists have to give housing and food to soldiers so that England doesn't have to build new forts for these soldiers. And over time, the colonists are going to get increasingly resentful of this increased troop presence, and especially the taxes and the things like the Quartering Act to help pay for it. And keep in mind, the American colonists were used to self-government, and these new taxes and these new rules are not coming from local governments. They're not coming from town meetings. They're not coming from the House of Burgesses. They're coming from across the ocean, from English Parliament, and from the King, who at this point is King George III, and you'll need to remember him. So these new rules come from across the ocean, and remember that the English colonies already don't feel that much allegiance to the British Crown, to King George, to the Parliament like they used to. They said things like no taxation without representation because they felt like these rules were coming largely without their consent, and they wanted to be ruled by their own consent. So now we're going to start a section of the notes that's basically a timeline. And you need to pay special attention to this timeline because there is a worksheet that will be connected to this. Okay, so the first step in the deterioration of the relationship between the colonist and the mother country is going to start with the proclamation of 1763. You can really see this as 3 rounds, almost like a fight. And in the first round, the colonists are going to resist the English, and then eventually the tension dies down. Then you're going to have round 2, and again, the tension will rise, but eventually die down, and there's not going to be a declaration of independence. Round 3 will not go so well. Round 3 is going to end with the Declaration of Independence and the beginning of the American War of Independence, or the Revolutionary War. So the first thing that the British do is more specifically, the first thing that King George III does is he issues a proclamation, and this is known as the Proclamation of 1763. Again, this is one you should highlight. This is a key term, if I remember correctly. And what King George III is going to do is he's going to basically draw a line along the Appalachian Mountains, and he's going to say to the colonists, if you look at the map here where I'm pointing, he draws this line. He says to the colonists, you have to stay on this side of the line, and you cannot go into this area. This will be reserved for the Native Americans. Now, the good thing about this, and I think King George III was at least partially well intentioned in this decision, was that this would keep the tension down. This would prevent another Pontiac's rebellion. But if you're a colonist, you're going to be very angry because you just fought a war called the French and Indian War, and you also fought in Pontiac's rebellion probably to have access to this land. And so the colonists are going to be mad because they feel like they're being deprived of the land that they fought and some of them died to earn. People like George Washington had nearly died trying to get access to this land. The southern colonists are going to be especially angry about this because they were needing more fertile land on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains to continue to grow things like tobacco. And now they're being deprived of the fruits of victory, if you will. So even though the rule says that they can't cross this line, many of the colonists, especially in Virginia, are going to start crossing the line anyway. And King George III is not going to be happy with disobedience. And this will be an example of the colonies basically standing up to King George III, ignoring what he says. Again, this is going to raise tension. So, of all the actions that the British take, this one is the one that angers the southern colonists the most because they're the ones that were most concerned with good farmland because they were agriculturally based. And they wanted to go into this area here that I'm pointing out because it was very fertile land. Okay, on to the next action by the British government that's going to upset the colonists. And this is especially going to upset the New England colonists, and that's going to be known as the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act of 1964 is going to be the first tax that's going to be passed in order to pay for the British troops that were being sent in. Now remember, again, the colonists don't feel like they need the troops. They feel like they can take care of things themselves. And if any law is going to be passed, if any tax is going to occur, it's going to be coming from a local government, not from King George III, who has never even seen the English colonists. So the Sugar Act is going to be passed, and it's going to be passed by English Parliament, not by a town meeting, not by the House of Burgesses, not by a local government. It's going to be passed in Mother Country England, and it's going to tax sugar and sugar products like molasses. Now, what's interesting is that this is a tax that's placed on the people that were trading sugar and molasses, not on the people that actually bought it in the stores. So this did not impact the colonists directly. More on that later, the idea of being taxed directly. So what do merchants do? Well, oftentimes they started to smuggle sugar, they started to smuggle molasses because they didn't want to have to pay this tax. And what ends up happening is that a lot of these merchants are going to be thrown into courts and they're going to be put on trial and they are going to be deemed to be guilty until proven innocent. Now, if you know anything about today's court system, you know that people are presumed innocent until proven guilty. The current legal system in the United States tries to err on the side of innocence. Well, it's not that way at this point. One of the reasons why we have some of the Bill of Rights we have, which include our rights in trial, is a reaction to how these merchants were treated in the 1760s. One thing to note is that it's a lot easier to prove or it's very difficult if you've been accused of being doing something that it's very hard to prove you're innocent. So the colonial reaction, of course, will be negative. They're going to say that the colonists are going to say that if any tax is going to be passed, it's going to be passed by local government. Uh, in fact, the colonists, even if they had representatives, they did not have representatives in the British Parliament. So one of the complaints will be, hey, if there's going to be a law that's going to be passed that's going to affect us, we should be able to send representatives to the British Parliament, which is like our Congress, to vote on these laws. But the fact is that even if the colonists had representatives in the British Parliament, they would be so outnumbered that they could never get their way, and in the end, they'd be run over by the mother country's wishes anyway. So other colonists, when they said things like no taxation without representation, they were meaning that taxes should only come from local legislatures. Taxes should not come from a government 3,000 miles away across an ocean. It should come from a local government. A good way to think of this would be to say if you're living in North Carolina and the government of Virginia tried to pass a tax on you, you would think that it would be an unfair tax because Virginia should worry about Virginia and any legitimate taxes should come from North Carolina instead. So at this point, the phrase no taxation without representation becomes pretty popular. And oftentimes it's associated with this bullet here that I'm pointing out. Oftentimes it's associated with the idea that the colonists had no representatives in the British Parliament. But I think it would be a little more accurate to say that the colonists were very used to governing themselves with local legislatures, and this is a tax that's not coming from a local legislature. They were not opposed to taxes even in and of themselves. They were opposed to taxes that came without their own say-so. So people will be going around chanting no taxation without representation. You might even see banners put out saying no taxation without representation. And that all started with the Sugar Act of 1764. And the taxes are going to get worse, not better. Now, keep in mind that another way to save money for the British troops would be to find a place to put them. And building a fort's expensive, paying for their food is expensive, so the British are going to pass a law known as the Quartering Act. And what the Quartering Act said was that the colonists basically had to give free food and free shelter to any British soldier. If you look at this picture here, you can see this family, and they feel like they're being invaded and taken advantage of by these British soldiers who are now in their house looking for a bed to sleep in, looking for food to eat, and the law required that the colonists provided this. And this really hit the northern colonies more. Boston will be the most hard hit by some of these laws, and they are going to be very resentful of them. So obviously resentment's going to grow, and one of the lesser known amendments to the United States Constitution is the Third Amendment. And the Third Amendment says that there will be no quartering of soldiers during peacetime, which today seems like a silly thing. It doesn't seem like it applies anymore, but it was a direct reaction to the Quartering Act that had been passed in 1765. So again, the idea of planting seeds, a lot of our U.S. Constitution, a lot of our Bill of Rights is a reaction to the abuses that happened to the colonies at the hands of the British during the Revolutionary period. Moving on to the next tax, and this is probably one of the most, if not the most, angering taxes for the colonists, and that's going to be the Stamp Act. So the Stamp Act is going to be the first tax, and you need to star this one or highlight this one because it's important. It's going to be the first tax that directly taxed all the colonists, not just those that were buying or that were merchants, not just the people that were shipping things on ships. And this law will be very extensive. It is going to apply to basically any paper product. So if you got married, it would apply to your marriage license. If someone died, it might apply to their death certificate. It would be applied to newspapers, posters, deeds to property. And notice that I point out here, even playing cards were required to have this special stamp put on it. And whenever the stamp was put on it, you were required to pay a tax that went along with this stamp. And almost every American is going to be using some sort of paper product. Almost every American is going to be reading a newspaper or buying a deed of land or playing cards. And all of a sudden, everything on paper is getting taxed. And it didn't really even matter how much the tax was. The angering part of this was the fact that it was a tax that was passed without local approval. This law was coming from across the Atlantic. From the mother country. So again, resentment is going to grow. And in fact, at this point, it gets violent. And so what you see in this picture here is a picture of a tax collector being tarred and feathered. So what ends up happening is you have some groups that are almost like gangs form, these kind of under the table, underground groups like the Sons of Liberty, and they are going to form to basically go after tax collectors, intimidate them, scare them, terrorize them, and most famously, they're going to be tarring and feathering them. So to be tarred and feathered uh, basically means that you get stripped naked in front of everybody in public. Then you have hot tar poured over your whole body, which may or may not kill you. It'll definitely hurt you. And then you are going to have chicken feathers thrown all over you. And that's going to be both painful, if not deadly, and if nothing else, extremely embarrassing. So here what's happened is this tax collector has been stripped naked. They've had hot tar poured over them. They have had feathers thrown all over them. They basically look like a big chicken, and now they've been tied to a pole by the Sons of Liberty, and they're now going to be marched around the streets, probably of Boston, uh, in very embarrassing fashion. And of course, the king, King George III, is not going to be happy with this sort of insubordination. Now, more officially and more civilly, you will see some colonists form a group known as the Staff at Congress. This is going to be the group that doesn't go around terrorizing tax collectors. They're going to try to be nicer about it, and they are going to basically ask the king, King George III, to get rid of the Stamp Act. Now, the king and Parliament are very unhappy with the way that the colonists are reacting to this law. They see the colonists as getting increasingly disobedient. But at the same time, they're starting to realize that this law is not really worth it. The Stamp Act isn't bringing in as much money as they thought it would. It's creating more tension, and this tension to a lot of the English government is not really worth it. Another thing that the colonists are going to start doing is they're going to pass what are known as non-importation agreements. What they're going to do is they're going to agree to stop buying British-made products. And if the British-made products aren't being purchased, that's going to hurt the British economy over with the mother country. And this is probably the part that makes the Stamp Act the most not worth it. Because the English government and King George III realized that if the colonists stop buying British products, the British are going to lose more money than they ever would have gained from the Stamp Act. So and one of the things that the British or the American colonists received from the mother country was cloth, and that cloth could be used to make clothing. The British were very good at making clothing, and suddenly all of the American colonists stood to not have any clothes. And so what ends up happening is you have another group known as the Daughters of Liberty, and this group is not going to be as violent as the Sons of Liberty, but what these women will do, these groups of women, is they'll start basically creating clothes for the colonists so they don't have to buy British-made clothing, and it helps support these non-importation agreements. Long story short, a non-importation agreement among the colonists is a boycott of British products. And this hits the British so hard in the pocketbook, it hurts their economy so much that they decide that the Stamp Act is not worth it. It's better to get rid of the Stamp Act and restore a positive relationship with the colonists. Here's another picture where you see someone being tarred and feathered, and again, you can see that's not a pleasant process. It's embarrassing, it's humiliating, it's painful, and you're going to see a lot of these taxes not even getting collected because a lot of tax collectors were afraid of suffering this fate. So eventually, Britain is going to respond to the protest, but especially to the non-importation agreements or the boycotts, by repealing the Stamp Act. However, at the same time that they did this, the British wanted to save face. They were embarrassed by how this had gone down, and they wanted to remind the colonists of who ultimately was in charge. So at the same time that they repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, they also pass a law to save face called the Declaratory Act, which says just what the notes say here. It's England declaring that they have authority to make laws over the colonies. So even though round one of tension is now drawing to a close, and the Stamp Act has been repealed, this victory for the colonists will be short-lived because England has already warned that they are going to start passing new laws in the future over the colonies, despite what the local colonies legislatures wanted. So England is basically saying, we'll back down this time just to keep the peace, but don't expect us to back down again. And again, eventually they will refuse to back down to the point that the American Revolution takes place. So that ends round one of tension. The Stamp Act has been repealed, but you can already see the seeds being planted for round two of tension rising. So, not long after the Stamp Act is repealed, within a year or so, you're going to have another tax passed. In fact, a series of taxes passed. So England is going to come back with not just one tax, but many taxes, and those will be known overall as the Townshend Acts. And this is going to tax lots of items like tea, like paper, like glass, other items as well. You can probably predict that we'll come back to the issue of tea being taxed. Tea was extremely popular among the colonists, and a tax on a popular drink is not going to go over well. You can see the seeds for the Boston Tea Party being planted here, but more on that later. Now, whenever these new taxes get passed, the British were well aware that the merchants would probably start to smuggle goods again to avoid paying the taxes. And so, what the British are going to do is they're going to create these warrants known as the writs of assistance that basically gave British officials almost unlimited power to search any merchant's products, to search any of their ships, to see if they were smuggling or not. And if you were found to be smuggling, then you'd be thrown into a military court. I'll get more to that in a second. But let's look at this idea of basically having a free-for-all warrant to search any colonist property for smuggled goods. This is forming the basis for the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, which says that you cannot be searched without a warrant. And to get a warrant, today police officers have to have a reason to get a warrant. They can't just search you for no reason. So this is again planting the seeds for the American Revolution, but also for the creation of the U.S. Constitution, which will be talked about more in the third unit of this course. Now back to those that were caught smuggling. If you were caught smuggling, you were put into what was known as an admiralty court, which is basically like a military court. And notice again, you are presumed to be guilty. If you are presumed to be guilty and have to prove you're innocent, you have a very uphill battle to climb. It's a lot easier to, well, let me rephrase. It's if you are accused of a crime, it is better to be presumed innocent and then proven guilty. If you're presumed guilty, it's very hard to prove that you're innocent. And so basically, not only are people getting searched left and right, oftentimes innocent people getting searched left and right, but you have innocent people oftentimes being thrown into court and thrown into jail because they couldn't prove that they weren't guilty. They couldn't prove their innocence. So this is setting up a court system that is biased against the colonists, and again, it sets the stage for future amendments to the Constitution. The Fifth and Sixth Amendments to the Constitution both deal with a person's right in court. So the colonists are going to protest again. At this point, you're going to have one man from Pennsylvania named John Dickinson who wanted to stay loyal to England, even to the bitter end, but he also wanted to have his rights as an Englishman restored. He wanted to have respect. So he's going to argue no taxation without representation, again, formally in a series of letters. Notice he's not asking for independence. He just wants to be treated fairly as an Englishman. So remember in the last unit when I kept talking about how the colonists felt like they had the rights of Englishmen? Now they're starting to really feel like their rights as Englishmen are being violated. They're starting to feel like they're not being treated as English citizens anymore. They're starting to feel like almost like slaves to England in a sense, where England can say and do whatever they want, and the colonists have no say in that. The man on the left-hand side is a very famous revolutionary, and he will be Samuel Adams. So Samuel Adams, he's probably one of the most radical of the revolutionaries. He is going to start sending around letters to the colonists, basically criticizing the Townshend Acts and encouraging people again to maybe boycott British goods, maybe to terrorize tax collectors. He probably took part in tarring and feathering of several tax collectors himself. But again, here's Samuel Adams. You've heard the name before. And he is going to really try to stoke the fire when it comes to resistance to British policies. And he's going to say it's time to boycott British goods again, and so they do. So the colonists are going to resume the so-called non-importation agreements, which again is a fancy term. It's on your key terms list, a fancy term for a boycott. So yet again, the British have taken action. The colonists aren't happy. The colonists feel abused. They feel like they're not getting their rights as Englishmen. They feel like they are not getting their local governments respected. And so they hit back, sometimes with terrorizing tax collectors, but also by boycotting British goods. And the tension, as a result, goes up. And this time, the British are going to be more heavy handed in their response, and they are going to start sending more troops into the colonies, especially New England, especially Boston, where people like Samuel Adams lived. So the British are going to go to what they saw as the kind of hotbed of resistance, the place where the most resistance was, which would be Boston, Massachusetts. And that makes sense because remember, Boston was a port city. A lot of trade happened there. A lot of products were bought and sold there, which meant a lot of these taxes that were unpopular were being charged in the Boston area. So when Britain sends extra 1,000 troops into the city of Boston, the colonists are going to resent that. They are going to feel like they are being invaded. They're going to feel like their self-respect and their self-government and the rights of Englishmen are not being respected. And they are going to basically make fun of some of these troops and spit at them and heckle them and curse at them in taverns in the evening. And that is going to reach a breaking point in 1770 when a crowd is going to gather around some British soldiers and they will be heckling the the colonists will be heckling these soldiers in Boston, and eventually chaos breaks out. A shot is going to be fired, and the British soldiers are going to be accused of killing 5 colonists for no good reason. Now, an interesting side story is that these soldiers are going to be put on trial for the killing of the colonists. And interestingly, future president John Adams is going to be their lawyer, and he's going to defend them and say that the colonists were actually much more guilty than anyone thought, and that they might have even been the ones to start this fight. And after the testimony in the trial, uh, he actually wins the trial, and the British are going to be found to be not guilty. So that's an interesting side story. So people always remember the Boston Massacre as being an abuse of the British troops against the colonists, but in court they were actually found not guilty. And I do have a primary source activity related to that subject. Regardless of whether or not the British were found guilty or innocent, people like Samuel Adams, who was actually a cousin of John Adams, is going to use this incident as a way to start portraying the English troops and the English government as being oppressive, as being tyrannical, as being unfair, as not respecting the rights of Englishmen. So even though the tension is going to go down because the trial shows that the British were likely not as guilty as people thought. In fact, there's a conspiracy theory out there that basically says that Samuel Adams was behind the British troops the whole time, telling them to fire until eventually one of them accidentally did. Uh, but anyway, back to the point. Samuel Adams is going to use the Boston Massacre as a sort of propaganda to promote the idea that the English government was evil, and it's people like him that are going to kind of keep this idea of possible independence in the back of the minds of the uh, American colonists. So the colonists will be furious despite the ruling of the trial, but Britain realizes that if they don't let up, they might have a bigger rebellion on their hands, and so they are going to back down and repeal most of the Townshend Acts. So again, you will see the tension go down, and that's going to end pretty much round 2 of tension. One interesting thing to note again is that John Adams at this point was defending the British soldiers not because he exactly liked what the British were doing, but because he felt like they were truly innocent. So he was pretty unbiased. He wanted to do what was right, and if he felt like the soldiers were innocent, he was going to defend them. Later on, in the next lecture, in fact, you're going to see John Adams become one of the leading people promoting independence from Britain or from England. But at this point, the tension is down. The soldiers have been found to be not guilty. But people like Samuel Adams are going to start putting out pictures to keep people angry about the Boston Massacre. So, for example, this is the most famous picture. This would be uh, a version of the story put out by Paul Revere. And if you look at the picture, you see that the soldiers here are all shooting in unison on innocent colonists. And the captain, Captain Preston, is ordering this firing to happen. This picture is incredibly inaccurate. First of all, they did not fire in unison. Second of all, the captain was actually in between the colonists and the soldiers, and only a very unintelligent captain would order a firing to happen if he was standing in the line of fire. And again, if you look here, the colonists look like they're unarmed. In reality, as the trial showed and John Adams showed, they had clubs, they had snowballs. Sometimes these snowballs had rocks in them, and they kind of started the fight. But regardless of the facts that made the British soldiers be found not guilty, in the end, a lot of the colonists, because of this misleading picture, are going to continue to look at the British as being oppressive and even killing innocent colonists and not respecting their rights, not respecting their natural rights like life or liberty. Thus ends round 2 of the tension between the colonists and the mother country, England. In the next lecture, I'm going to go through round 3, and I'm going to talk about how that goes unresolved and how eventually the tension does reach the point of further violence and eventually the American Revolution. And then the lecture after that, I will talk about the war itself.